There have been many cultural battles going on across the country, writers not allowed into cities, films being banned and then unbanned, discussions about books, discussions about comments, art exhibits attacked by political organizations. There has been some discussion about questions of freedom of speech. There have also been discussions about people's feelings being hurt, people feeling politically attacked, socially attacked. It's a very complicated soup. Luckily for us, today at Newsclick, we have the writer Githa Hariharan, whose many books include In Time of Siege and Fugitive Histories. Githa, welcome. So tell us, Githa, there have been all these cultural debates. What do you make of them in general?
Well, I think, as you say, there's been so much happening and it's such a murky soup that perhaps to understand and make sense of what is going on, we should treat the whole thing like a sort of I imagine it as a syndrome. And that metaphor actually allows us to say, well, what are the flare-ups, the acute manifestations, and does that mean there is in fact a chronic condition? And I think that that's important to separate, because we pay attention only to the flare-ups. We might overlook the fact that it indicates a certain chronic condition. And if I could actually explain that, I would say that what do these flare-ups constitute? There is, of course, in a way, perhaps the most straightforward manifestation is hate speech. And I say straightforward because honestly, when you look at the examples, you have the recent examples of competitive hate speech with Akbaruddin Owaisi on the one hand and Praveen Togadia on the other hand. This is not new. You have earlier examples, Varun Gandhi, and earlier the mother of Veenam, Sadhvi Ritambara, who has also given various inflammatory speeches. So I think there isn't very much argument about what is hate speech, because it just jumps out at you. And also, in terms of dealing with it, it's relatively straightforward because there is a legal mechanism in place and the state does have to intervene swiftly and effectively. And I want to add here that when we're talking about offenders and offended and the offense, and in fact, offense here, I think, is rather important because people in general, society in general, has to actually take offense, and this offense should fuel protest if the state is not taking adequate action, timely action. So I would say hate speech, that is one aspect. Then the other aspect, slightly more complicated, is a certain form of vigilantism, which is married to a kind of cultural vandalism. And again, we have here numerous examples. And before I go to the examples, what I want to say is what ties all these examples together is that the fact is that these are not really a question of hurt sentiment, which we'll come to later, but they are planned projects, they are planned political interventions. And if there is a pretense of spontaneity, it is actually choreographed spontaneity. And I think in a way, the destruction of the Babri Masjid is a sort of a model for this choreographed spontaneity. And I think the examples that are useful are, of course, what happened with the Naya Theatre, Habib Tanveer's plays. In 2003, we had the extraordinary situation of some of these plays that they had put up all over the country since the 60s. Suddenly, you had a situation where the play was about to be put up, Ponga Pandit, and suddenly you had 17 people in the audience objecting to the play being put up, and under the eyes of the district collector, the audience was escorted out. And they weren't even very clear about what they were objecting to. They said, well, you can't call a Brahmin a fraud, and so on and so forth. So that was one sort of thing. Then, of course, you had the attack on the Bhandarkar Institute in Pune. And that again was really kind of stage managed, because you had the splinter group Sambhaji Brigade of the Maratha Seva Sangh, and they needed an issue because the James Lane book had already, there had been protests, and the publisher had withdrawn the book.
This is the book on Shivaji.
That's right, the book on Shivaji. The publisher had apologized, had withdrawn the book, and the author had apologized, and in fact a historian who was in the acknowledgements had had his face starred, and so on and so forth. But how were they going to do a new take? So they actually took 150 men, fed them, and took them in jeeps to the institute to vandalize. They physically vandalized the place, and incidentally they also destroyed some of the relics and in fact a couple of portraits of Shivaji as well. So that was a kind of, to make a debut in public space. And then you have, of course, the example of Ram Sene again, saying that there's a pub culture which needs to be changed, and then you attack women. And of course, culture being embodied in the bodies of women is always an attractive thing to do on stage. So I think these are some of the examples that we've had, and the most recent being Durga Vahini, who attacked the art show in Delhi, which was an art show on the nude and the naked in art. So what happens then is that I think it's very clear that there is a measure. I think one needs to ask, are these being choreographed by people who are part of an organization which already has a record for
this kind of violence,
for dividing people through vandalism? So I think that would be the second. And of course, the trickiest of all is this whole business of hurt sentiments, hurt feelings. And I think that is what we...
Let me ask you to go a little further than this. I mean, what you've given us are two emblems of hurt speech. One is where politicians, of basically elite kind of politics, meaning, leading political parties or people like that, have competitive hate speech across communal lines, maybe, sometimes across caste lines, etc. The second example was of what you call choreographed vandalism. But even that is often political agents, powerful political agents, powerful communities taking offense. It gets a little complicated, don't you feel, when it's powerless communities that say that our sentiments are hurt. How do you understand the sentiments of offense among the powerless? Say somebody says, this language is deeply hurtful to me. I have so little in the world anyway, and now you're dancing on my grave, as it were. So how do we deal with offenses, or the feeling of offense from below?
Yes, that's an interesting question. But before I get to that, I just want to say that I don't think, in fact, that the examples of hate speech and cultural vandalism are cases of hurt sentiment at all. In fact, I'm suggesting those categories to say, let's get away from it all being hurt sentiment. They are not, in fact, talking about hurt sentiments. I'm just saying that you can't look at this republic of hurt without looking at those other examples, because they're all part of the same syndrome and they result in the same chronic situation in a society. As far as hurt sentiments go, I don't think one should actually divide that into the powerful and the powerless. I think the most important thing is to look at it quite clinically and say, all right, who's hurt? Everybody has a right to be hurt. Honestly, the Durga Vahini's idea of women offends me. And so I have every right to be offended. But what do I do with it? Do I write about them? Do I stand with a placard outside one of their events? That's the question we're talking about. So I would say that whether those who supposedly take offense are powerful or powerless, the point is to say that what is the track record of the offender? because there are many, many different kinds of offenders. And I think this is terribly important, because many of us writers and filmmakers and artists would be out of business if we didn't actually offend. But, you know, that is offend in the best sense of the term, which is that you are exposing, you are questioning. And what kind of a society would there be if you didn't do that? So to take offense, I think, you know, so think of the Ambedkar cartoons, for example. You know, you could argue that here is one part of our society that's been at the receiving end, that, you know, historically has been portrayed in a negative way, which is putting it mildly. I think what is important then is to say, who created this comment or cartoon or speech or film that is offending you? What is the track record of that person? This is quite important, because filmmakers, intellectuals, you know, writers have other work to, you know, to their name. So you say, well, X has said this or written this, but he has also taken somewhat anti, say, Dalit positions elsewhere, in which case then you pass judgment on him as you would on an intellectual or a filmmaker or a writer. You criticize.
And you criticize the body of you know, I mean, putting it in context of the
Exactly.
body.
Exactly. So there are systems in place. I mean, it is not to say that there, you know, there are any number of writers and filmmakers and public intellectuals who have obnoxious opinions, or so we, you know, I might think, and they might think my opinions are obnoxious. But there are certain acceptable forms of taking offense there, which is that you debate.
Let's go into an area where this gets complicated, because what if somebody says that I agree with you, that I am from a community that's relatively powerless, I have been denigrated, I agree with you that speech should be met by speech, criticism or denigration should be met by criticism, but I don't have a loudspeaker. Nobody is there to listen to me. I have done a counter cartoon, it's not getting published. So then all I have left to do is to go into somewhere, you know, and assert myself as best as I can. You know, what does one say to somebody who puts it like that? Which is to say that, yes, criticism against denigration, but nobody's listening.
But you see, you're talking about a situation which doesn't happen. You only know some groups' feelings are hurt when it is there in public space, which assumes they have already found a way to express it. So I don't think it's a question of, you know, I mean, life would not be possible if you were going up and down the country asking. There are people who are upset and concerned about what's happened to their lives. That is, you know, for God's sake, offense is part of our lives now, but it's actually a problem. And that is not necessarily the means through which we should be expressing our distress at our powerlessness or our lack of space, you know, in the public limelight. So I think that would be overdoing it. In fact, I think what we need to do is say that this whole business of taking offense in public, because in private we're taking offense all the time and should, and express it through whatever means is available to us. But in public, to say I have taken offense and therefore remove this offending object, whether it's a cultural artifact or a, you know, a comment or whatever, from public space, and do not allow anybody else to see it or hear it, is just not, it's not acceptable. Because we've spoken about hate speech where the state does have to intervene. And in these situations, unless we get used to the idea that you cannot, in fact, remove this offending object, we are never going to develop to a situation where we say, look, this is not hate speech. This is not vandalism, physical or cultural, because other people have the right to see this art show or what, you know, see this film that you are objecting to, and it does not come under hate speech. Now, once that has been taken care of, well, if you are hurt, feel hurt, you know, and if you have any means to debate it, to express your sense of hurt, to examine the offender's record and say, look, look, this is what this person stands for. And you have to see this particular offense in this context. And that is all there should be. Because then, what you get is you get a whole lot of other problems feeding into the chronic problem, which is a situation where we have mob censorship because the state, is quite happy to let other people do the censorship. You also have a situation where who is expressing the hurt in public? That becomes very important. Who is being playing spokesperson for this group that has supposedly taken offense? And we're also getting into this dangerous situation of homogenizing groups. Muslims are hurt, the Dalits are hurt, Hindus are hurt. Since when that is the chronic problem? Correct. We are moving towards these sort of, a divided society with homogenized packets, which is simply not true.
Well, thank you so much. More constructive criticism, more debate, more critique, less mobs, less censorship. That's the world that we believe in at Newsclick. We'll be back to this topic. Thank you so much, Githa.